As Lucille Ball's tired and worn out heart stopped beating on that early morning of 26th April 1989 and that familiar hoarse voice was forever stilled, her friends and fans seemed overwhelmed with sorrow and a sense of loss. Almost all fans felt as if they had lost a member of their family.
First, about the death of one of the inventors of television comedy, Lucille Ball. Before there was a global village, before the medium was the message, there was Lucy. Week after week, from the 1950s to the reruns, still running worldwide in the 1980s. Lucille Ball died today at 77, a little over a week after heart surgery. Correspondent Jerry Bowen reports on the outpouring of respect and love for an actress who made a nation laugh out loud in the living room.
Yes, she did. She died this morning.
The news from the hospital was a real shock. Lucille Ball, recovering so well from emergency open-heart surgery just 8 days ago, died suddenly early today. Even hospital officials were stunned.
She was even beginning to walk a little bit. Her spirits were good. Everyone felt very optimistic. There was no reason to suspect that anything was about to occur.
Coming down here on the left-hand side, this is Lucille Ball's house right here. Just passed away this morning.
Her family went into seclusion. Friends and flowers began arriving at her Beverly Hills home, and tributes flowed from Hollywood royalty and loyal fans alike to the queen of comedy.
She was a friend. We loved her dearly, and she's truly going to be missed.
What she did for television, what Chaplin did for silent movies.
She inspired women comics. You'd have to be inspired to watch her work and realize that it's possible for a woman to get laughs.
So no matter how many tears we cry today, the laughs outnumber them. I love Lucy.
All major networks stopped their regular programming midway to announce her death. Some simply put up those two dates after her name on the screen to make it all the more irrevocable. 6/8/1911 to 26/4/1989. The next day, all national dailies reported her passing on their front pages. Editorials, probably written in advance when she had been admitted to the hospital in critical condition a week before, spoke of her astounding fame all across the globe. The fact that hers was the most recognized face on earth was repeatedly emphasized. Doctors who had saved her by a marathon surgery earlier regretted that they could not save her this time. All those who loved her were comforted to know that she had been surprised and happy to see the deluge of get-well messages and flowers in the hospital. She had been despondent at the cancellation of her show, Life with Lucy, and seemed to find solace in the concern and affection of her fans. Her last hurrah had been an appearance at the Oscars ceremony a few weeks earlier with her favorite co-star Bob Hope. Though frail and still recovering from a stroke she had suffered the year before, she was as gracious, charming and composed as she always was in public. The sight of the beloved old-timers electrified the audience as they, cheering and clapping, gave them a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. More than applause, it must have seemed as a reassurance to the First Lady of TV that she was still loved and admired for all she had done to keep her fans entertained and happy for the past several decades. Visibly moved, she seemed her old self, kidding back and forth with Bob Hope till her job done, she sailed out on the arm of her husband, and seemingly still on a high at the recent accolades she gave the fans who spotted her and called out to her a glimpse of those still beautiful legs by striking them out as she had done so many times while dancing on her shows and stage appearances. That must have been a night to remember, and also to ponder over a life so eventful that it had the makings of a Hollywood pot boiler. That night, from an account of a guest, Lucille Ball cut a backgammon game short and retired to her bedroom without a word. It was during the lockdown, as the pandemic raged outside, while watching long-forgotten TV shows like MASH, Different Strokes, Who's the Boss, Little Wonder, and The Lucy Show, that a new respect dawned on me for the Lucy character. All the other shows were tinged with melancholy. MASH was downright depressing. A bunch of people pushed into a war they did not want or understand. In different strokes, one can see the tragedy of two orphaned black kids trying to come to terms with their new relocation, with one of them obviously being a special child. In Who's the Boss, it was a successful young divorcee who seeks male support even if it's a housekeeper. Only Lucy in all her 4 avatars seems to personify a never say die spirit, trying to make the best of a bad situation, exemplifying the adage, nothing ventured, nothing gained. She never broods over past mishaps and failures, but jauntily and optimistically starts a new day with new hopes and ventures. And she did all this with a disarming charm, honesty, and a generosity of spirit which touched a chord in her audience. Then and now, all of us want a pillar of strength, of unwavering morals and values who will never change in an ever-changing world. We yearn for something permanent to hang on to, something good without any conditions or compromises, and such role models are harder to come by with each passing day. Perspectives change, values change, and the world as we have known it flounders in a sea of humanity who don't need or heed those old world morals or values anymore. Lucille Ball in real life, as well as a screen persona of Lucy, enshrined a model code of conduct throughout her life and in her on-screen antics. And amidst all the doom and the gloom, she still lifts our spirit by her sheer exuberance and childlike simplicity. When Lucille Ball departed this world at the age of 77, in a flurry of national and international shock, grief and fulsome tributes, the magnanimity of the wrench people experienced was unprecedented compared to other celebs and peers of that time. The hospital where she was admitted was inundated with cards and flowers, overflowing to the corridors and passages. A banner on a popular joint opposite her hospital urged Lucy to get well soon, hoping she would notice it from her window. Though her children chose to withhold any comforting words to the public on her passing, the fans who had rejoiced in Lucy's shenanigans did not fall short of the occasion. They created a block-long condolence card and piled her home and her star on Hollywood Walk of Fame with flowers, cards, and toys. Lucille Ball's passing was somewhat like the assassination of President Kennedy. The difference was that Kennedy's death was sudden and shocking, while Lucille had been known to be ailing for quite a few months, and her week-long stay in the hospital before her death had more or less prepared the public for the final goodbye. And yet, when it happened, the fans still seemed unprepared for the parting from one who still lifted their spirits in their drawing rooms through the reruns of the various Lucy shows. National and international dailies reported the death of someone said to be the most recognized face on earth. TV shows stopped regular screenings to announce the death of the Queen of TV, who had made the medium her own and may have been a big reason for its soaring popularity in the early 50s. Fans made block-long condolence cards to give to the family and heaped flowers on her Walk of Fame in Hollywood and in front of her home. Almost all studios held day-long remembrance programs where her friends and colleagues remembered her meteoric rise and never say die spirit. But all through this outpouring of grief for an old, retired, well-loved icon, there was deafening silence from her husband, prompted no doubt by the daughter who had assumed all responsibility for her mother now that she was dead and could not argue with her plans. Had she treated her mother's death as she treated her father's, there would be no recriminations. Then Lucille was alive. There was a proper memorial service for Daisy Sr., But for Lucille Ball, there was no religious formality. It was almost as if the family pet was disposed of without any fanfare. No plans for the funeral were shared with the public because they did not plan to have a formal funeral service for the great Ball, who was being mourned the world over by her millions of fans. And when the commotion about her death did not ebb, Catholic masses were held in 3 different cathedrals, where there was no chance of participation for her long list of close friends, which I think was the whole purpose behind this step. Otherwise, Lucille had emphasized time and again that she was not a Catholic but a Baptist. During her marriage to Desi, Lucille had strongly rejected the effort by her mother-in-law to convert to Catholicism. To deny her belief system after her death was exactly what could be expected from a callous next of kin who were out to trivialize her passing and shift the attention to themselves, which was Lucy Arna, her daughter. Lucille Ball was a devout Baptist and had recovered from a devastating divorce with the help of the religious intervention of Reverend Vincent Peale. So impressed was she by his teaching that she had insisted on him marrying her to Gary Morton in 1961. In several interviews, she had praised his advocacy related to self-esteem.
I'm George Burns, and welcome to Christmas in Beverly Hills. Jimmy Stewart asked me to open the show. I said, why me? He said, because you spend more Christmases in Beverly Hills than anybody, including Santa Claus. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just opened the show.
From the Beverly Hills Presbyterian Church, welcome to A Beverly Hills Christmas with James Stewart. Mr. Stewart's special guests tonight are Lucille Ball.
Hello. Hello, I'm James Stewart, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to the Beverly Hills Presbyterian Church for our annual Christmas celebration. This has been our family church for the last 30 years, and for a large part of that time, I got to sit back there in our pew, just like you folks in the congregation tonight. But then, back in 1978, our new musical director asked me to read the story of Christmas. I liked the idea, and I did, and I guess it must have gone all right because they keep asking me back every year, and that's fine. I like that. You know, the miracle of the Christ child, of his birth, has been retold now for almost 2,000 years. But it's a story that will never grow old. And tonight, reading the story of Christmas with me is my very, very special friend, Lucille Ball. And we're very pleased to be joined by the beautiful voice and presence of Denise Williams. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And Joseph went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, onto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child.
And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them at the inn.
Religion had been the saving grace of Desi Jr. when he enrolled himself in a rehabilitation program with his parents' full support in the early 80s. He was weaned away from his addictions and has remained sober since then. In an interview, when asked the 3 words most important to him, he surprisingly said, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Lucille had often publicly offered prayers for the nation, and her participation in the Christmas program in the Beverly Hills Church, along with Jimmy Stewart, was worth watching, because even at that age, both knew the readings by heart and didn't need to consult their notes even once. In interviews, she said she felt guilty for approaching God only when she needed help. Her children remembered her teaching them to pray before they went to sleep. Against this backdrop, it seems criminal to allow her remains to be interred without a priest and without a word of prayer. Christians across all faiths believe that the body should lie in a state of grace in a consecrated grave. Surely, being a devout and practicing Christian, she would not have left specific instructions that she be buried without a prayer like an atheist. Her own arrangements for the funeral of her beloved grandmother and grandfather should have been the model for her own funeral. As it turned out, from Gary Morton's account, she was cremated and her ashes placed in the plot which she had reserved back in 1977 next to her mother. There was no priest, so no formal prayers. According to Gary, we just talked to Lucy and to each other, and that was it. All three went back never to return, either at her death anniversaries or to lay flowers at her birthdays. Even Gary Morton never visited her grave, saying it was out of his way. The daughter's resentment had survived Lucille's death, and this godless send-off to a God-fearing, devout Christian was her way to be dismissive of her mother's importance and popularity. She was able to do it because Gary Morton, intent only on his share of the estate, wouldn't have wanted to argue with an important co-beneficiary for fear of creating roadblocks. He wasn't going to fight for a dead wife's right to a decent funeral. As for the adored son, he wasn't going to question a sister who had always had the upper hand in the family hierarchy, mainly due to his addictions and problems. So the daughter, who had never got along with a resolute mother, usurped her stepfather's right to make the decisions for his wife, assumed that authority, and made the most callous and insensitive decisions on her behalf. In life, she gave her mother no pleasure, and in death, she ended up disrupting long-held rituals for the onward journey of her immortal soul. The age-old Christian rites of burial are seen as an acknowledgement of the mighty power of God, the Creator, who hastens the soul on its onward journey in the next realm. Prayers and religious services give solace and closure to the bereaved family, but sadly, those in charge of Lucille Ball's final send-off seemed eager to dump her in a grave in a hurry, sans her closest family and friends, and get on with their lives, with all the money at their disposal now. It wasn't as if the religious aspect did not occur to the intrusive daughter, because in the foreword to her mom's autobiography, she states that it was difficult to plan the funerals of her parents because they had not discussed such things with their parents when they were alive. In Lucille's case, it was Gary Morton's prerogative to plan his wife's funeral, but it was Lucy Arnaz who took over the responsibility for the decisions about the way the last rites were to be conducted. One can imagine the way he must have been shoved off stage by Lucy to hog the attention and importance of the moment. Even as Lucille lay in critical condition in the hospital, Desi Jr. had departed with his wife, and Lucy Arnaz, the publicity hound, had buzzed off to accept an obscure award on her mother's behalf. Only 2 years ago, the siblings had dropped out of the planned tribute to their mother at the Kennedy Center Honors, citing their grief at their father's passing. And here was Lucy, eager to be in the limelight as her mother lay suspended between death and immortality. Lucille had, in private chats with friends, assumed that it would be Gary who would arrange her funeral after she died. But Gary may not have been so eager to claim his rights as a husband in such matters. He was busy watching out for his financial welfare with his lawyers. Lucy could do what she wanted, as far as he was concerned. Despite his strong religious beliefs, Desi Jr. did not argue with a sister he has not been too close with, either, preferring to deal with his feelings alone. Lucille herself may not have minded this abrupt goodbye. Perhaps, just happy to lie peacefully alongside her mother, overlooking the Hollywood hills, the scenes of their triumphs and failures. But Lucy Arnaz was not finished disrespecting her mother's memory just yet. After Gary Morton's death, not satisfied with the millions she had inherited, her rapacious gaze once again turned to the lonely graves on top of the beautiful Forest Lawn Cemetery in Hollywood. Emboldened by her ability to manage the affairs of her dead mother by virtue of being her next of kin, she undertook a project to rob her mom of even the basic dignity to lie in peace in the grave she had arranged for at least 12 years before her death. All of Lucille's well-laid plans for her beloved Didi and herself were dashed by her daughter turned nemesis now. Just as Desi Sr. had kept up the abuse till it broke his tormented wife's spirit forever, so now his female replica played a return date to deal the ultimate blow to her mother's memory. The Arnazes, Desi Sr. and his mother had time and again professed to be devout Catholics, but perhaps Lucille had seen through their subterfuge soon enough. In the radio program Hollywood Byline in the late 1940s, before the Lucy sensation, when she was far more outgoing and candid, in an answer to a question, she had confessed that she was a Baptist and not a Catholic as Desi supposed she was. In her autobiography, she was more forthcoming, saying she did not follow up on her plans to embrace the Catholic way of life, seeing it did not seem to do her husband any good. Not to her daughter either. In an interview with Dick Cavett in 1971, Lucy at age 19 was condemning and criticizing the nuns of the school she attended in Beverly Hills for being too strict in enforcing discipline. How typical of a spoiled brat to expect preferential treatment even in a school. But it was obvious that religiosity and a sound moral fabric was never part of the Arnazes' DNA, the exception being Desi Jr., who saw the light and turned his life around to the profound relief of his parents. But he did not interfere in his sister's officious meddling in their mother's affairs, even when she exceeded her brief as a daughter. So unhindered, Lucy Arnaz did what few progeny would dream of doing to their parents. She desecrated the graves of Lucille Ball and her mother, and plucking out their ashes, took them to Jamestown. So unhindered, Lucy Arnaz did what few progeny would dream of doing to their parents. She desecrated the graves of Lucille Ball and her mother, and plucking out their ashes, took them to Jamestown to be dumped in a common grave in Lakeview Cemetery, close to the Lucy Desi Museum she runs along with her children. Not satisfied with selling Lucy artifacts, in a way she put up her mother's ashes as an added attraction to bring in more paying tourists. The niceties of the grave and its promise of eternal sleep may never have crossed the mind of this cold, calculating, manipulative woman. Does this wanton desecration of a person's grave not constitute abuse of that person's right to an undisturbed burial, especially if he or she has paid for that graveside much in advance? The fact that this raid was carried out by a daughter does not make it any less criminal. Why didn't the concerned authorities take action or stop the greedy daughter from her nefarious designs? Even now, the innumerable Lucy fan clubs can get together and demand that Lucille Ball's mortal remains, along with her mother's, be restored to the Hollywood Cemetery according to her wishes in her will. That would be the ideal homage to a beloved icon, instead of buying up tacky memorabilia which only fills the coffers of the perpetrators of this crime. This time, Lucy's beloved friends who are still around, like Paula Stewart, Betty White, Carol Burnett, Liza Minnelli and Michael Stern, should be the ones to honor her, and her children should be banned from any participation.
You're keeping them away from the press. Well, I did, not so much anymore, but up until they were old enough to run, I did. Yeah, I don't know, I was fanatical about pictures of my kids, for obvious reasons. I'm very protective. I'm probably a lot of mothers are like that, but Everybody thinks my mother was worth $462 grillion, and I had these Frank Sinatra Jr. fears. You know, I don't know. They weren't warranted, thank God. My kids are fine, but
what's going to happen when they grow up and they're going to find out Grandma was this big star, Mommy's a star, Daddy's a star? We want to be stars. Would you let them go into the business? What if they came to you right now and wanted to do what you did when you were a child?
That's a really good question, and I never...
1 out of 14.
That's pretty darn good. I can see why you do this now. Well, you know, it's very tough. If they have to do it, if they want to do it for the right reasons because they can't do anything else, they have, you know, that thing you have to perform. God, if it makes you that happy, you've got to do it.
But you didn't know that as a child, did you?
No, but you know, see, if they come about it the same way I did, which is that I saw what it was like to be as famous as you could get. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people say, oh, you know what? I'll be a perfectly happy person if I get to be enormously famous. That will solve all my problems. That's it. That's all I need. Then they get there and they see that it just creates a whole lot of other problems.
Yeah.
Well, I knew what it was like to get to the very top. So for me to go into this at all, it wasn't to be famous. It was because I loved acting. Now, that doesn't say that it's a great profession to be in. It's sporadic. You could make, you know, if you're Meryl Streep, a couple $1 million a picture. Or if you're somebody else who only works once a year, you better make a lot because it goes out real fast. And God forbid you get a series for 5 minutes. You move to the hills, you get the big house, you get the cars, you get the stuff, and then the series is... And then what?
You sell the big house.
Oh, my God, now you're starting to live like you have... Larry and I are constantly saying, we have to just live like normal people. And of course we don't. I mean, you're tempted, you know, you want the best for your kids. Put them in private schools, do this, do that. Then you're at the mercy of saying, I take that job, I don't want to do that job. I want to do this job. We're about probably getting ready to do a lot more theater now, go back to the East, spend more time in the East Coast because it's what we love. You can't really make a great living in the theater,
no.
but you can love what you do, you know.
Now, your parents made a lot of money, not $42 million zillion dollars.
Yeah,
but then what did your father do when the series was over? Your mother kept active.
Well, you know, it was when the marriage was over. That was really the key point. The series was over when the marriage was over. That's why they stopped. And my mother and father were divorced, and that's why the I Love Lucy show stopped. And after that, he kind of hid, and he drank a lot. And he had a few other shows that he pulled out of the hat a few years after that, Mothers-in-Law, and he produced my mother's The Lucy Show and whatnot. But progressively, he was more and more depressed and went through a lot of his money gambling and pretty much hid out and never got the acclaim that I think he deserved because he was the brains behind all that comedy talent.
And a brilliant comedian.
Absolutely.
You go back and you look at the Lucy shows. Your father's incredible.
I always thought he was a lot funnier than her naturally. I mean, as far as doing the physical stuff, she was the queen. But just as far as having humor and dry wit, he was... I mean, I get my humor from my dad, not from her, which is odd, but I do. Because he's a naturally funny kind of guy, and he always used to see things funny. So that's kind of depressing that he ended up a drunk.
How did that get you?
See, they're not laughing at that because it's true.
It's true, but a lot of us...
Am I right? I mean, it's weird, isn't it? And you look around, did anybody see Punchline? Must have killed you, right?
Yes.
See, that tore me up. I laughed through the whole thing, and when that scene came where his dad came into the room and he broke down and couldn't go on, there's so many people who become the funniest people on earth because they have such pain that they're trying to get through, and thank God they have that. I mean, you never put it down because thank God for the makeup that is in your body that lets you be a survivor, however it is.
But you survived. You survived. The divorce must have been devastating. How old were you?
7.
Who are you closer to? Your daddy or
my
mom?
Dad, but I wasn't allowed to be. Because I know that now. I would tell you my mother if you'd asked me 12, 14 years ago. But I know that emotionally I was closer to my father, but I was always told what a bad person he was, you know, and no, that's not fair. Don't get mad. Not a bad person, but there was always a little bit of the poor soul. Do you know, that poor soul, he can't get his life together. And so I felt like, God, if I emulate him, if I admire him, if I'm proud of him, I'll end up like that, you know, but I didn't like what I was seeing over here either, because there's a control freak here, and somebody here, but she, you know, she had to be in charge 24 hours a day. She loved us in her own way. I'm sure she loved us in the only way she knew how, because if you spin the circle back far enough, you got to say, well, where did that come from? Had to come from her family. And I loved my grandmother, but maybe she and my mother didn't get along. Do you know? It's just fascinating in a way, and sad that the circle goes on and goes on. So the bottom line is, you asked me about how I raised my children. I have these 3 terrific kids. Well, I didn't know a lot of these problems existed until I had children. Nobody teaches us how to be parents. It's the only thing we're ever going to do that's important in our lives. Forget the marriage, forget the career. You have a baby, you're supposed to raise that child and send it out in the world, a whole human being. Nobody teaches you how to do that. So you rely on what you instinctively know, but you don't know what you know till it's time to say, get that off the table! Where did that come from? Oh my God! And so then you start to back up and go, well, I guess that's what I heard, you know, gee, that's not right. And here I am, and I'm trying to figure it all out now, because either you pass it on or you stop it and you fix it, you know?
So what are you stopping and fixing?
I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying to say, well, now let's talk about why you had to put all that paint all over the furniture, children. You know, I mean, it's about not using ridicule and sarcasm to raise your children. It's giving them some kind of respect. Children are little tiny blank pieces of paper that we bring into this world, and they could be anything. And it's what we put on them that makes them what they are.
How old are your kids then?
They're 9, 7, and 5.
What about drugs? Because you've had a family, you had a dad that drank a great deal, your brother.
My brother.